Today's special guest is Alyn Smith, who has been an SNP MEP for Scotland, the whole of Scotland, since 2004. He's on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Delegations for Relations with Iraq and the Arab Peninsula. Alyn's well known for an impassioned speech he gave after the referendum result, where he told the European Parliament, "Scotland did not let you down. I beg you, do not let Scotland down." Hello, Alyn. Welcome to Remainiacs.
Hello there. Great to be here.
That was a particularly stirring moment. The 25% of my genes that were Scottish became very, very electrified at that moment. It was a proper, a proper sort of flag in the sand thing. Did you realise that you were going to make such an impression with that?
Well, until a couple of minutes before, I didn't realise I was making a speech at all.
Oh, right.
It had been proposed. Speaking time in the Parliament's very rigorously organised, because in a group of 751 people with umpteen languages, you've got to be very militant about it. So our group co-president had suggested that one of the Scots should close the debate, but we decided for the moment, let's see how it's going. But when I saw what Nigel Farage was trying to do successfully, he was saying, yeah, I'm the voice of Britain, hate me, throw us out.
Yeah.
I'm not going to let that bastard speak for my country, however we define my country. And hence I reached out to the other bits of the UK that voted Remain, and to the 52% is not a mandate for Nigel Farage speaking for me.
Yeah. And
went down to the front of the hall, clapped a hand on his shoulder. I left bruises, apparently. It was at mate and one of those minutes. And he said, yeah, do it. So I got hardly any time to prepare, but actually I'd spent the last 8 weeks or so in a miserable European referendum campaign where there was arrogance on all sides, there was complacency, there was ignorance. It was a dreadful debate. I'd actually been writing that speech in my head without realising.
Yeah.
For ages. So it was from the heart. It was also, I have to say, it was on the verge of tears throughout all of it. It was a real emotional moment, and it was just the counter. Looking back at it, it was the counter that everybody else needed to counter the unrelenting negativity that was coming out of the British Isles at that point. So it did rebalance things a bit.
It's remarkable for such a momentous event how little decent rhetoric the whole Brexit process has produced. There are very few memorable lines, and the things that are memorable for all the wrong reasons. Brexit means Brexit. Such a pathetic non-statement. There are very few soaring moments of inspiration to be heard. And I suppose that just, I don't know, maybe that's the measure of the moment.
Well, in my case, if I keep the Tourette's under control, it's a win. So I was particularly happy with that one. But yeah, the whole Brexit debate has been revelling in ignorance, and actually much of the aim of the debate has not actually been to inform prejudice away by giving people facts and information. It's been to pander to it.
Yeah. Alyn, the SNP have been pretty reticent on a final say referendum. Scottish Liberal Democrat leader Willie Rennie said you need to get off the fence on this one. Why is this why this position? YouGov polled 2,000 Scottish adults. 66% of SNP voters want a final say vote. Just over half of Labour voters thought that Scottish Labour should commit to it as well. You're in a safe space, Alyn. You're amongst Remainiacs. Explain the SNP's stance on a final say referendum right now.
Well, firstly, I should thank you on Willie Rennie's behalf for exposing him to a far bigger audience than he's used to. So that's nice. It beggars belief that the Liberal Democrats in Scotland would use their conference plan. Now, I know Willie going back a number of years. Yeah. The idea that he'd use that to have a pop at the SNP, which has neither caused Brexit nor is working to make it happen, is absurd. Our attitude to the people's vote, and right there with the name of it, the people's vote, and who voted in the last one? Badgers. We need to be respectful of democracy, or else the electorate will give you a bloody nose. Now, the SNP, we know something about having referendums. Yeah. Referendums are close to our route to independence because we're utterly democratic, and you can't go back to the people and say, you got it wrong, do it again. So we must be respectful about all of this. So that's the starting point. There's also then the practical issues about, well, it's a vote on what? Now, there's been a very useful paper published Wednesday this week by John Kerr and a few others by the People's Vote about a roadmap to how that might happen and the parliamentary mechanisms and that sort of stuff. In order to legislate properly for a referendum on whatever it's going to be, that's going to take a good chunk of parliamentary time, which will necessitate an extension of Article 50. So that needs to be requested by the UK government. And these are serious practicalities that have been just glossed over by a number of folks, and we need to take that seriously. The question itself, is it a question remain within the EU versus the deal? Yeah. In which case, what's the bloody deal? What's going to be in it? The deal is going to be possibly a fudge about 3 different heads. It's going to be the financial provisions on exit, citizens' rights on exit, some sort of backstop on Northern Ireland. That's it. So we're not actually going to have anything meaningful beyond a political declaration annexed thereto, which is meaningless to anybody, and will be all things to all people, for people to actually base their decision upon. So my concern with that would be that the thing will default back to, do you want to be in, do you want to be out? And the debate will be every bit as bad as it was first time round. And one of the most toxic things that I think is a massive bit in the armoury for the Leave campaign is that the EU hates democracy. The EU told the French to vote again on this treaty, the Irish to vote again on that treaty, the Danes to vote again on that treaty. I think that's worth a big dunt in the polls for them. Apologies to Ian. I think that's a big dunt in a good way for them.
It's a Scottish word.
They enjoy it.
It means wonderful, right?
But we've got to look at the long-term sustainability of, will a people's vote actually provide a solution to this? Or will it just be 52 to 48 in the other direction, in which case you weaponise the right, and UKIP will go full Britain first. We can see that happening before our eyes. Gerard Batten, their leader, this week praising Islamophobic groups. It's gruesome stuff that's happening, and we need to be really sensitive that if you go to people and say you got it wrong, there will be a backlash. So we're reticent to this.
Is it really this, or is it that you sort of sense you really want another referendum on independence and you're wary of using up this stock amount of referendum political capital that you have on something which frankly matters to you less than independence?
Oh no, the first, and I've written a number of times on this, I see no scenario where Brexit makes independent Scotland more likely. I think the economic chaos, the societal chaos that we'll see will make people less amenable to change. So my job's to stop Brexit for the whole of the UK if that's possible. What I'm really talking about from the bottom of my heart is that, and bear in mind, we've done a lot more referendums than you've done. And if there is a big chunk of the electorate that feels that their Brexit was stolen and their Brexit would have been magic, but a motley coalition of filthy Remoaners, jocks and paddies stole it from us, that will go somewhere, and it won't go anywhere good.
The thing is,
if you want a
to
sustainable result to this, we need to be much more measured.
If you want to stop Brexit, though, and you don't support another referendum on the terms, what is the alternate strategy for doing so? Because doing so without another referendum seems like it would be much more poisonous in those regards.
Yeah. Oh, sure. I didn't say we're opposing it. I said we're not persuaded, and we're reticent. If it becomes a thing in England, and I'd personally be looking for opinion polls above 60%, for a consistent period for that to happen. And I very much agree with Ian's point that the clock is ticking on this. But we'd need to see that sort of sustained desire for this to happen in England. And bear in mind, we voted 62% across every single counting region to remain in Scotland. The idea that we should vote again to save a problem that we didn't create, that's already putting our backs up. So if it becomes a thing in England, I don't see any scenario whereby we'd stop it because the people of Scotland want to remain. I think you're right. Only a referendum trumps a referendum. And I don't see much bravery from many of the MPs at Westminster to turn it round themselves. But it needs to be done in a sustainable way that's actually a long-term strategy about the UK getting rid of the chip on its shoulder to the EU engagement. The UK has always, for decades, had a sniffy, arm's-length transactional approach to the EU. And if we just flip this vote back by a narrow majority, and the polls suggest that it would be a narrow majority at the moment, then we'll be back here in 5 years' time and it'll be even worse.
All of that makes sense, and I don't disagree with any specific point that you've raised. But nevertheless, if only a referendum can trump a referendum, and we are opposed to Brexit, that sort of suggests that the only possible policy that one could support is another referendum. Without that, you sort of find yourself in the position, I think, validly, because all of the points you raised were fair, you sort of find yourself in a position where you're tacitly supporting the Brexit that is being pursued by the government because you're not offering any alternatives to it.
Well, we have committed ourselves in Scotland to an independence referendum once we see what the details of Brexit are. Now, we can't, within Scotland, stop Brexit happening for the whole of the UK. We respect England's democracy. England voted to leave, and we can't stop that happening. But in terms of what we've committed to, we've committed to an independence referendum in Scotland against independence or remaining within the EU. But what I've said, if it becomes a thing in England, I think it's obvious to the dogs in the street that our guys at Westminster are not going to stop it happening. And you know where we're going to be. But there's also the idea that the people who are into Brexit aren't great fans of the jocks either. So would a Scottish voice in that debate be counterproductive or not? I think that's an open question.
I think for me this is another sort of head in hands moment, because I'm worried about the dissolution of the UK completely after Brexit. We know all the focus has been on Northern Ireland, but I mean Scotland, in all honesty, if we do leave the European Union, I can't see a situation where there wouldn't be another indie ref, and that might go to. I mean, you're in European Parliament every week. Have you had chats with guys in corridors saying, if they go, we want to stay? So how would that look? There must have been those conversations had.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
Our party's proposition remains independence within the European Union.
Yeah.
But we also, and take us at face value, the 2014 referendum, all of us put our heart and soul into it, and 45% pro-independence, 55% to Romania. That's a solid result. And we accepted that result. And we were told that we're a family of nations, mutual respect. All Scots know their history. We voluntarily merged by the democratic standards of the time, which were pretty shonky, but by the standards of the time, we voluntarily merged to form Great Britain. It was an international treaty. We're a partnership of equals. If you want to remain within the EU, you need to back the UK. If you want a stable economy, you need to back the UK. All of these promises have not been fulfilled.
Yeah. I don't blame you. That's the thing. I don't blame you at all.
And I'll say from the bottom of my heart as well, I was at Leeds Uni, Nottingham Law School. I was a city lawyer up the road here in London. I'm no stranger to Soho, though the less we say about that, the better. I've got a lot of affection for England, and I fear for where England's going with this. And I think the Brexit vote, and this is where I hope David Cameron doesn't sleep at night, to have any vote about anything at this point in the UK's history, when there's so much discontent about where people are in their lives, so much discontent with where England's democracy is, because if you're in a safe seat, be it Labour, Tory, whatever else, your vote hasn't mattered for decades.
Yeah.
Now, in the independence referendum in Scotland, we saw a lot of people who checked out of the democratic process 20, 30 years ago, often going right back to the poll tax days, re-registering on the electoral roll to take part in the referendum. You don't do that to endorse the status quo. And we saw exactly that in the run-up. Remember, in the run-up to the EU referendum. This was where a lot of people who feel ignored and shut out of politics suddenly felt their vote mattered. And it was a vote for change. I don't think the EU was actually uppermost in their minds. It was a vote for change. Let's give the establishment a slap. Yeah. Much more visceral than that. And these are the people who I think are movable. But I think we need to do that in a much more graduated way than we're seeing today. And too much of what I'm hearing from a number of the campaigns who I think are all well-intentioned and working with all of them across the parties. But if the mood music that comes across to Joe Public is you got it wrong, do it again, that will not give the right result.
I think it's very rare that anybody on the People's Vote side articulates it in that way. They talk about you need to look at the deal properly, you need to have a say on the deal, rather than you got it wrong, do it again. And I think it will be a stretch to imagine that anybody could argue that Europe made us vote again. Europe, you're there the whole time. They seem serenely uninterested in bringing another vote to bear. Alyn, Scotland needs immigrants. Scotland really needs immigrants. What's your response to this? It's going to cut off a supply of valuable people to Scotland.
Exactly. I'm really glad of the fact that there is a cross-party consensus across all the parties in Scotland that we need more people, not fewer. Wherever they're coming from, freedom of movement has been great for Scotland as a society, as an economy. And I mean this really personally. I grew up in Saudi Arabia as an immigrant myself. My folks are still in the Middle East. Having to deal with immigration stuff is something I remember personally. And my sister's living in California, having to do green card stuff. That stuff. The idea that the UK has not done that, and I will praise Tony Blair for it. It was the Blair government that opened the doors as widely as possible to freedom of movement on accession of the Central Eastern European states. That was great for the UK. And what I like about this report, and I don't think this report's going to live in anybody's memory for very long. I don't think it's one for the ages. But what it has proven is that immigration has been financially fantastic for the UK. And I think we need to ram that home to everybody. And we cannot pander to people's basest instincts. I mean, we've seen this with the Jews in the 1300s, with the Irish and various other points. The worst mark of a scoundrel is blame the foreigners. Blame somebody else. Blame somebody who's not like you. Blame somebody who's not from round here. That's poison. That goes to a really bad place really fast. And in the internet age where we can all tweet hate speech at each other, even faster. So it's really important that the words we use are Scotland is welcoming. If you're here, you're one of us. One of the things that I'm most proud of in the Scottish Government's programme for government, we are going to legislate to make sure that EU nationals and nationals from elsewhere will have voting rights in Scotland post-Brexit. Because we've got voting rights now, we will make sure that your right to vote in Scotland is not going to be about your nationality, it's about living here. So if you live here, you're one of us, you're part of our community, you have a right to vote because you're part of our commonweal. That's not where the UK is going. And what worries me about this report, exactly as Ian says, it's a group of people who've made the facts fit the narrative rather than the other way around. And Mrs May has said, and I think it's one of the few things she actually does believe, she thinks that immigration should be in the tens of thousands. Now, that's a fast track back to the 1950s. That's bloody dreadful stuff. And it offends me on every possible level. And I think we need to face that down for what it is, because if we pander to that, and there's enough people like Nigel Farage and the rest of them that will seek to inflame that, fear of the other, fear of there's a continuum to this stuff. And I think this report is really unhelpful in that it actually ignored the facts and then sang along with a narrative. The idea that there's good immigrants and bad immigrants, it's the same as the deserving poor versus work-shy scoundrels.
I find it weirder
it's
than
dangerous.
that, because I actually think that the facts don't support the narrative. So it's almost it feels like it's almost just like there's this sort of white half, and then there's a completely opposite second half where you just think like, well, nothing that you have just said supports the conclusions that you have come to. They seem like they're completely bonkers.
Looking further into the future, as part of the kind of the vision for an independent Scotland, what's the immigration component for an independent Scotland, and does it apply to valuable English people like podcast producers?
we will have an expansionist approach to such matters.
Okay.
Look, we're a welcoming country. I mean, we're a third of the UK landmass. We've got the vast majority of the marine territory that the UK presently enjoys. We've got oil, we've got gas, we've got wind, we've got biomass, we've got everything in spades. And we're not full up. We're a very, very big country that needs more people and wants more people. And I am really, as I say, really pleased that there is a cross-party consensus in Scotland that if you're here, you're one of us. Where you're from, of course, most of our immigrants come from England. But they're not immigrants, they're New Scots. And I, as a politician, if I get into you're more Scottish than you are, that's a dangerous cul-de-sac. So my attitude and the attitude of the Scottish Government is, if you're here, you're one of us. How Scottish you feel, well, that's your business, that's personal. But we will always be welcoming and open to more people coming in. And that's where freedom of movement has been great for us. And that's why we want to keep it. And that's why if the UK is minded to carry down Mrs May's disastrous fewer than tens of thousands road, then it's possible, and there's things to work out, but it's possible that we could see a different immigration policy for Scotland. We had that before with post-study work visas, so there is precedent. The Canadian provinces administer immigration differently. We need to look at all the options, because if we see ourselves locked into this fast track to the 1950s, it'll hit us worse than it'll hit most places.
Alyn, I mean, we're talking about English history here, but, the SNP is a nationalist party, and there's a fair bit of William Wallacery to be found in Scottish nationalism. You're not averse to it yourselves. A fair bit of harking back to the great history. How do we kind of wean people off this idea of seeing everything through a prism of great deeds done in the past according to possibly not very reliable accounts? Is it possible?
Well, I have to say, I take issue with the characterisation of where nationalism is. I mean, our proposition for Scotland was all about the future. And what makes a nation is, well, that's history and that's all interesting. And every nation's unique and every nation's got its good points and its bad points. I have no doubt as a Scot that my ancestors were slavers and opium smugglers and tobacco smugglers, mainly on my mother's side, I'd imagine. But you can't look at that. You can't
by
pretend it was...
Oh,
seriously. Honestly. She's going to tell me off for that. But we're having a debate in Edinburgh right now about putting a plaque beneath Lord Dundas, who's one of the biggest statues within Edinburgh, who was single-handedly responsible for delaying the abolition of the slave trade. So you can't look at a country's history and say we were the goodies. And like Ingrid, having grown up abroad, the idea that the Brits were the good guys is something of a loaded question in big chunks of the world. Yeah. So you can't play the historical stuff. And a nation either is or is not, exists or does not. And sitting over in Brussels, what makes up different places is very different. Within the UK, we're unusual in that our borders haven't changed that much in a long time. Where look at the Czech and Slovak republics, look at Flanders, look at Belgium, look at the Netherlands. Borders move. Look at Strasbourg, where we go on a regular basis. They don't actually change the signs; they just wait for them to fall down and replace it with a new language, whichever it is these days. That's something that people can get used to. But it really strikes me that the Brexiters, they only use the past to justify what they're trying to do. Very few of them are talking about the future in any meaningful sense at all. And they're using this delusion of bygone glory And we were the good guys. We'll muddle through. We stood alone before. You know, there was one of the UKIP MEPs said we made it through the Second World War. You were born in 1958. You couldn't make it through a fast jog. You ludicrous individual.
We didn't stand up and vote to have the Second World War visited upon us, did we? We didn't stand up and say, I've got a great idea. Let's get all our cities bombed to rubble, and then we'll see if we can get through it.
And I think it shows the paucity of their ambition and the paucity of their intellectual case as well. When we had, forgive me, harking back to Scotland, but that is what I do. When we had our independence referendum, there was a 650-page prospectus and lots of other documents for the individual bits as well that people could kick the tyres off and test. And some people were persuaded, some people weren't, and that's democracy. I took one of the UKIP MEPs to task over a pint because I'm a sociable wee soul. I'll go and speak to as many folk as I can to keep channels open. And I was lambasting about it. Well, where's your prospectus? You know, it's perfectly legitimate to say, I want to leave the EU. But you've got to say what you'd replace it with, or else it's a false argument. And in Scotland, we've got Norway just over there, we've got Iceland just over there. We know that there's other ways of doing this. There was historically an element within my party that didn't want to be part of the EU either, because we want democracy to be as close to us as possible, and the EU is a supranational, yada, yada, yada. That's now not the case. But it's a legitimate argument. But my objection to the Leave campaign is they took a conscious decision, and he confirmed to me that they did. We learned from your experience, the more you told people, the more you were held to account. So because people were left with a fantasy option of there'll be Brexit unicorns on every mountain, there'll be a windmill for every voter, £350 million for the NHS, who wouldn't vote for that? Because it was everything you like you'll keep, everything you don't like you'll get rid of. And it grieves me even more that that's where we still are within the UK's debate on this. There are still people who are saying, I will keep that. I will definitely keep the Erasmus programme. I will definitely keep pet passports. And we'll definitely keep that. All of these things are possible, but there's going to be a massive price tag attached that isn't attached presently. And it grieves me that there's a likelihood that people will only realise what they're losing once it's too late.
Alyn Smith, thanks for being with us on the show. We had Sept MEP on Remainiacs a few weeks ago talking about.
God love him.
He's great.
God love him.
He talked about what it's actually like to be an MEP, and it feels kind of sad now. Like you're still at the party, kind of apologising for the relative who punched everybody and went home, but you're still there trying to kind of make nice with people you really like. Does that resonate at all? Well,
sadly, the relative who punched everybody is now rolling about naked over the buffet table. The problem is they've not gone at all. It's strange days. I mean, I've been an MEP since 2004, so I'm in my third term now. Grand old man that I am. I was elected just after my 12th birthday. It was great. So I've got a number of pals within the house. I've got people who I have long-standing relationships with. So there's a lot of goodwill in the bank, and that's really important. Likewise, Seb, who I love to bits. There's a lot of us are working cross-party to help debates within each other's party, to help debates within each other's constituency. There is a good cross-party cooperation going on, which has kept certainly me going. I suspect it's kept a lot of others going as well. I mean, the feeling of powerlessness of this, and this is where, back to my point earlier about the UK's sniffy arm's length attitude to the EU's democracy. I have said for 15 years, I'm not some sort of diplomat. I'm not lolling about in silk cushions, not most of the time anyway. I am passing domestic law in a different place. And we're doing that in conjunction with umpteen other countries as a block of 500 million people. Now, if you're talking about organised crime, climate change, which remains the biggest thing that's actually facing us right now, how to deal with the internet, how to deal with a globalising information economy, you're going to get a better result as a block of 500 million people, because otherwise China will set the standards or the Americans will set the standards. That's the global reality we're living with. So we're dealing with big stuff, big issues, and all of that's still going on. But so much of the UK's debate about Brexit has been by posh boy know-nothings who are quoting Pliny and whoever else and pretending with their generations of public schoolboy confidence, but actually talking complete mince about how the EU actually works. So even look at the Chequers deal. Yet umpteen politicians have said, well, we've agreed at Chequers. And it's like, good for you, sweetheart. That's great, doll. But 27 is actually a bigger number than 1. And everybody in Brussels for months has said, this isn't at the races, guys. And yet it's still being put forward by people with a straight face in the public schoolboy confidence I'm talking about, as if it was actually something real. And the MEPs within each party, and I will say the SNP is different in this. I'm a member of our national executive. My colleague is our party president, right the way back to Winnie Ewing in the times gone by. We've always had the European question at the heart of what we're doing. I don't think that's the same for a lot of the other parties, and the MEPs have not been part of their party's discussion about this. And Sept being an honourable example, Richard Corbett being another, there's a number of the Labour folks, a few of the Tories as well, are working hard to make these points. But there's been that disconnect between political UK and how Brussels actually works, where the MEPs were an afterthought for year after year, sent over to, the amount of times even I've been asked, how are things over in Europe? And it's like, well, you're in Europe now, Bawheed. You actually, this is part of what we're doing. So it's sad, and I think there's a lot of people who are going to realise what's actually in danger of being lost, and I don't think it's lost yet. But certainly as an MEP, it's a sad time. It's been tough.
Yeah. Just returning to that, we talked about it earlier, the question of what Brexit means for another independence referendum. It's the hot issue. Like a lot of English people, including David Bowie, I really didn't want Scotland to leave, and I was very glad that the independence result went in favour of staying in the UK. Circumstances have changed enormously. What is your argument and the SNP's argument to an Englishman like me that I should support your stance on Scotland leaving the Union? Well, not that I have a vote. It doesn't really matter in some respects, but what would...
No, we want to maintain really close relations. We're not going to change geography. We're not going to change the social union. We're not going to change the fact I'm an English qualified lawyer from Leeds University. All of that stays. We want to maintain as close a relationship with the UK as we can. Now, bear in mind, in 2014, our proposition was that we'll all remain within the single market, we'll all remain within the customs union. So much of the nuts and bolts stuff that people might notice of a change actually wouldn't exist, because it would be a matter of shifting status within the EU for Scotland to accede to the top division, but the rest would stay the same, because the single market legislation, that wasn't part of the picture. So the proposition is going to change next time round. And there's practical issues for us to get round, and that's why we've reset the timetable to an independence referendum, because we need to see what the reality of Brexit Britain is in order to formulate the proposition about what we're going to become independent from. Because we are not going to have the sort of debate that we saw from the Leave campaign, where we'll just ask people to vote for an abstract. Scots are canny. We want to kick the tyres of what it is. We want to see how, we want to test it. We want to have a good idea of what we're actually voting for. And my sense of where people are in Scotland now is that there's a big chunk of the population who were not persuaded last time round. Not hostile. Most people weren't hostile. But there was a number of people who weren't persuaded. And they're now looking at the UK saying, well, hang on, I didn't vote for this. I didn't sign up to this. We were told we'll have the most powerful parliament short of federalism. That was not delivered. We were told we'll remain within the European Union. That's in the process of not being delivered. We didn't vote for people like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg to have a serious part in our government. And the more that we're hearing of where the UK might be going, the more we're thinking, well, hang on, we've got another choice here. And because the European question was absolutely fundamental to the independence referendum, and not least a number of EU nationals who, of course, had the vote within Scotland to vote because they're part of our community, a lot of EU nationals voted no on the basis that they didn't want to threaten their EU status. And that's democracy, and that's quite right. But we're now seeing that a lot of the promises that were made have not been lived up to. Now, we must make sure that this is a utterly democratic process. We're going to make sure that there's an intellectual proposition to test. But I have to, and I say this with some sadness, I think we need to look at, well, what's going to serve the people I serve, which is the people of Scotland, best. And it's not our responsibility to make sure England elects sensible people. And I see a number of people in the Commons who are just flatly not sensible people. Right
It's funny, though, for a lot of us, because we do see ourselves as part of the same country as Scotland, and we feel a sense of solidarity. So when you say things like, it is not our job to think about, how this is operating, it's sort of, there's a further step there, which is also like, and also we kind of want to get out, so we don't want to really concern ourselves too much about what the consequences are for you either.
Well, that's the difference of perception. And I've got a lot of English pals who have said, well, we're one country. I said, well, no, we're not. We're 4 countries and 1 state. And we have got a lot of differences within Scotland that we can dress it up as it's wee things, like when English people talk about the North East, they're talking about Newcastle. When we're talking about the North East, we're talking about Aberdeenshire. A difference of perception about where we fit in the world and where we sit. there is a big chunk of the people of Scotland who are very nervous about where Westminster rule might be taking us. Now, there's a big chunk of people in England nervous about where Westminster rule might be taking you. But forgive me, we've got a different constitutional history and we've got a different option and a different choice.
I do understand this thing of course, legally it's a different country. Of course it is. But that's not, how it felt when we were growing up, especially when you come to an immigrant family like mine. You almost never really associate that strongly with England. What you associate with is Britain. And I think the reason for that is because it has multiculturalism baked into the bones of how it operates, that its starting assumption is that different tribes can live together in a way where they share a sense of solidarity. So it's very strange for us when we see Scottish nationalists who obviously most of the time are talking, left-wing, social democratic stuff that we agree with, that we're obviously sympathetic to, suddenly start talking about the end of that solidarity in that way. It's very, very hard for us to sign up to the idea that that's in any way progressive.
And also, I was born in Liverpool, and, where I grew up, everybody was Irish, Welsh, Scottish, and English was an odd, nobody ever talked about an English heritage. England seemed to be a place that happened in the southeast, south of Birmingham. So we sort of feel like...
That's actually where I live, by the way. Yeah, and it was shit, so you missed out.
And it's interesting to hear you talk, because you Alyn, was talking about you grew up in different countries. So actually, for you to belong to the SNP, which is obviously the Scottish Nationalist Party, that's quite interesting. As in you decided that, rather than that you'd seen lots of different parts of the world and you didn't feel like a citizen of a particular place, you very strongly identify with Scotland. So that's
it's a conscious choice. And cards on table, I was always small p political, wasn't party political. I volunteered for the Labour Party a day a week when I was at law school. I worked briefly for the Lib Dems at Westminster. As a volunteer, only ever joined one party, that was the SNP, after an internship in Brussels, where it became clear to me that Scotland is already viewed, and this was 20-odd years ago, that Scotland is already viewed as a distinct thing. So, and this is the point where Ian's talking about solidarity. Well, there's a lot of people in Scotland who are doing great. There's a big chunk of the Scottish population that has grinding poverty that we need to fix. And we're not fixing it. And as part of the UK, we're not fixing it. We don't have the tools to do that. And we need to have those tools at home in Scotland. We need to have full control of our resources. And then it's up to us to make those decisions. At the moment, UK rule means that we remain a small minority within the UK, and our interests will not be at the forefront of what the UK does business for, because we're a minority. And Exhibit A being the Brexit vote. We voted 62% to remain across every counting region, the islands, mainland, cities, urban, rural, and we're being told to get to the back of the bus, shut up, and let Theresa May negotiate on our behalf. That is disrespectful of our democratic choices. And we have got a political apparatus within Scotland with a national parliament, a national government, that we, the people of Scotland, expect better than this.
Yeah. We had Kirsty Blackman of the SNP on the show a while ago. She was great. She was a wonderful guest. She talked very convincingly and very soothingly about the idea of civic nationalism, the idea that, because on this show, we have a fear of nationalism, and I think it's well-founded, because English nationalism is an ugly thing, and it's growing, it's rising, and it has a nasty side to it. It can't be denied that there is also a kind of a over-enthusiastic and occasionally can be quite vicious aspect to Scottish nationalism, the cybernats, where you'll be absolutely torn to shreds on Twitter if you advocate anything other than quite a doctrinaire approach to one idea of Scottish nationalism. I'm not accusing you of having anything to do with it, but it is part of the spectrum. How do you maintain a strategy towards an independent Scotland while not allowing that kind of thing to get out of hand? Sure. I mean, we saw things like big intimidatory marches outside the BBC, which looked kind of weird from our perspective. How do you deal with that?
Well, the online stuff is being amped up by external forces. I've commissioned some research, which I actually have here, which we're putting out next week, about the extent to which there is external influence on Scottish Twitter especially. And if you want abuse, well, I get plenty of red, white and blue and orange abuse myself. As a gay out pro-European nationalist, I get quite a bit of abuse from other points of the spectrum as well. I don't think any particular political agenda has a worse problem with that. I think we all have a problem with online discourse, and I think that's something that we need to fix. You'll be hearing more about that in the next couple of weeks. I've written to Twitter with some ideas about how we can fix that. But in terms of the old ideas of the blood and soil nationalism, well, we've faced that down, and this is where I think we in Scotland need to help the people of England to have this discussion, because England is the great unexamined country. because for so many people, England and Britain were basically interchangeable and we all rubbed along and that was fine. Much of that was based on an ignorance of how things work in other bits of these islands. Northern Ireland, the extent to which Northern Ireland has not been part of the discussion within Brexit, pre or post the referendum, is absolutely negligent, is dangerous. So coming from Glasgow, I've been back and forth to Belfast a lot, and it's really, really sensitive, and it's not being given the sensitivity that it deserves, also in terms of the sensitivities that we have in Scotland, having just had a referendum where the European question was important. We're being told to get to the back of the bus. That's not good enough. Now, we're the third biggest bloc at Westminster presently. We're not without arms within the parliamentary arithmetic. We'll use that. But in terms of England sorting out where it fits in the world and where it sits, sadly, I think Brexit is a symptom of a wider crisis where the UK just needs to get real about where it actually is these days. The empire is a thing of history. The UK is a medium-ranking European country, which will achieve far more by being part of fully the European Union, get rid of this sniffy arm's length what used to be special nonsense, actually buy into it properly. My best example of this was how the Europe Minister of the UK was until very recently a junior Minister of the Foreign Office. And yet, as we're now seeing in black and white, so much domestic legislation came via the EU apparatus. But the UK, even within the floor of the House of Commons, it was always, that's just over there. That's not, and denying the fact that we are part of this throughout. And in Scotland, because of my party, I think we're about 20 years more advanced in that discussion, where we've always been comfortable with a multi-identity. I'm Scottish, I'm British, I'm European, and whatever measure of that cocktail you feel, well, that's your business. But the fact is, you live here, you're one of us, so you've got to vote and you've got to say. England's yet to have that discussion, and I fear that the Brexit vote was a spasm of nostalgic, well, I don't like where things are, this is something, let's shake things up a bit. I don't think an awful lot of people who voted Leave actually had much of an opinion about the EU at all, which is where, as I say, I think we can move things. But from a Scottish perspective, yeah, we must make sure that we stick to our values. It's civic nationalism. If you're in our community, you're one of us. Blood and soil is something very much something of the past.
One final question. You called for there to be a Scottish entry to the Eurovision Song Contest. If we will support that, if you support our support of a final say referendum, is it a deal? Handshake here and now. We're behind a Scottish Eurovision entry if you're going to back final say. Sold. Fantastic. You heard it here
amazing.
first.
That was easy.
That was very effective.
How diplomacy works.
Absolutely.
You've got the gays worked out. There we go.
That's that. Gays Worked Out is my middle name.